January 30th, 1944. Anzio, Italy. The commander of the German 715th Infantry Division, looking at the maps of his line of defense, pointed to the bunkers with conviction. These positions are impassable. For years, German doctrine had bet all its chips on the solidity of concrete. Underground fortifications, reinforced pillboxes, entrenched positions, all designed to withstand what the Germans called conventional fire. But what approached Anzio was unconventional. He was a mathematician. That reliance on physical invulnerability was about to be disintegrated, not by bombers, not by tanks, but by a 12-ton artifact, mass-created by civilian workers in the United States. The 240mm M1 howitzer, designed to demolish fortifications with surgical precision, not only destroyed enemy positions, he redefined warfare, and with it a new form of combat was born, the systematic destruction of German doctrine by the cold logic of industrialized artillery. This video will reveal how the U.S. turned steel, calculations, and logistics into terror, how a gun designed by engineers and operated by American farmers dismantled decades of Prussian military beliefs, and why, in the face of the roar of this machine, not even the thickest concrete could survive. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any speech. Between 1944 and 1945, the U.S. Army fired 118,129 240mm shells at fortified German positions. Of these targets, 81% were obliterated with an average of only 3.8 shots per bunker. These were not cities. They were not open fields. They were concrete fortresses, designed to withstand bombardments and hold entire divisions. What was supposed to be protection became a trap, and the dull sound of these explosions marked the end of a doctrine. In this video, you'll see how a spreadsheet-designed, factory-designed weapon changed the fate of the land war in Europe. If you value military history and believe in the importance of recording these forgotten details, consider leaving your like and subscribing. This helps us to keep alive the memory of the facts that shaped the century. German defense doctrine between 1936 and 1944 was built on reinforced concrete, an absolute belief in engineering, and a traumatic memory of World War I. The so-called Siegfried Line, or West Wall, symbolized this obsession. More than 18,000 fortified structures, spread over nearly 630 kilometers of border, designed to counter any offensive from the west. It was a subterranean world, buried casemates with walls up to 2 meters thick, command bunkers armored by steel and concrete, interlocking tunnel systems, anti-tank shelters, machine gun nests with vegetal camouflage, minefields, and tooth dragon barriers. This warlike architecture was not improvised. It was meticulously calculated to withstand the impact of artillery up to 150 mm, the standard caliber of the Allies at the beginning of the war. For the German generals, this was enough. The mistake, deep and structural, was to imagine that the world would stop at the same caliber. This view of invulnerability came from the Prussian doctrine inherited from 1914, the war of position. The mentality was clear. Whoever dominated the ground and strengthened their defenses would survive the weather. General Alfred Jodl in 1939 synthesized this logic when he stated, "Germany will not be defeated in the open, but only if her lines are broken. That we will never allow." Behind this trust was the TOT organization, the engineering arm of the Reich, responsible for transforming topography into a wall. With tens of thousands of forced laborers, including prisoners of war, civilian laborers, and compulsory laborers, the Reich invested colossal resources to create what they called the Festung system, a system of fortresses designed to halt the enemy offensive before it picked up speed. This system was not limited to the Siegfried Line. It stretched across occupied Europe, from Cassino to Normandy, from the Italian Apennines to the Ardennes. The bunkers were not simple shelters. They were command centers, points of final resistance, landmarks of a mentality that believed in concrete as a substitute for mobility. And for years, it worked. At Monte Cassino, a small garrison of German paratroopers sustained weeks of aerial bombardment and Allied attacks. Sheltered under a medieval fortress converted into a bunker, the logic was sound, literally and figuratively. The Allies could bomb, but the Germans remained inside. On paper, A bunker with 2 meters of concrete would withstand dozens of direct hits. But in the field, this math lacked an unexpected variable. An entire nation across the pond, turning civilian steel mills into military production lines, smelting steel by the ton, designing new weapons not to match but to surpass. The German command ignored a vital fact. In 1943, the U.S. produced 25 times more steel than the Reich. This disparity was transformed into artillery, vehicles, ammunition, and cannons. While the Germans celebrated the delivery of another 600 mm Karl mortar, the U.S. projected a mobile 200 mm howitzer, complex to assemble, but produce at scale. One impressive figure: for every functional German railway howitzer, the U.S. had the capacity to manufacture and maintain more than 80 M1 howitzers with full logistical support. If this number surprised you, comment below. Absolute power. The shock of this asymmetry would come not on intelligence maps but on the battlefield, when German soldiers took shelter in reinforced pillboxes, only to see them disappear with a single hit. Reinforced concrete, the ultimate symbol of Nazi defensive engineering, would be disintegrated not by brute force but by precision calculations. The U.S. Army didn't need to hit an entire sector. It just had to find the coordinates of a bunker and wait for the hollow sound of the impact. The German belief in the fortress as a psychological obstacle would be reversed. The bunker would be seen as an inevitable trap. As late as 1944, during the Allied advance into France, Wehrmacht reports revealed perplexity, fixed positions being neutralized within minutes, officers reporting localized seismic impacts, units abandoning non-combat posts, and more alarming, soldiers refusing to enter bunkers, preferring to expose themselves to light fire than to be crushed under tons of collapsing concrete. The very concept of static defense, a pillar of German doctrine, was beginning to crumble. But the real turning point was yet to come. On the outskirts of Anzio, a German engineer watched through the periscope as an entire bunker, designed to withstand 209mm shells, disappeared. He noted in his diary, "There was no combat. There was a disappearance." What he did not yet know was that the howitzer that had reached his position was only one of the 6 that would land in that sector, and that soon it would no longer be positions, but entire mountains, medieval cities, and historic fortresses that would face the same fate. In the next chapter, the enemy would hear for the first time the sound of the weapon that was not made to shake. It was made to extinguish. In April 1940, as Germany celebrated the conquest of Norway and France prepared its defensive lines for what they believed to be a repeat of 1914, a group of military engineers from the U.S. Army Armaments Bureau wrote a report that would not make headlines, but that would turn the tide of the war 4 years later. The study, technical and direct, analyzed the real capacity of the American artillery in the face of the new European fortifications. The conclusion was clear and quietly devastating. The 155mm guns, until then considered the gold standard of U.S. ground artillery, could not reliably destroy the concrete-reinforced bunkers used by the Axis powers. Even direct impacts caused only superficial structural damage. The fortified positions survived, and with them, their occupants. It was the harbinger of a serious doctrinal failure. The enemy had evolved, and the American artillery had not. It was this technical realization that initiated an urgent, multidisciplinary effort to develop a new generation of super-heavy artillery. But unlike the European approach, based on fixed, slow assembly, limited operation rail parts, American engineers proposed something radical: a weapon with tactical mobility, capable of being transported in road segments, field-mounted, and fired with mathematical precision. The requirements were almost absurd. The weapon was to fire 360-pound, 163-kilometer projectiles at distances greater than 25 kilometers, with a penetration capacity of at least 2 meters of reinforced concrete. In addition, the entire system had to be compatible with the existing logistics infrastructure, standard military trucks, mobile cranes, and field crews. The project was given the technical name of the 240mm howitzer M1, and behind the scenes, it was simply called the Bunker Breaker. Development began at Watervliet Arsenal in New York State, a military facility with more than a century of tradition in heavy weaponry. There, civil and military engineers worked under secrecy and maximum pressure to transform theoretical specifications into functional steel. The challenge was not just ballistic, it was structural. The barrel of the gun, 7.3 meters long, had to withstand forces equivalent to 2.8 million foot-pounds of kinetic energy per shot. This required special metal alloys, heat treatments in very high-temperature furnaces, and mechanical tolerances of less than 0.01 inch on components weighing more than 2 tons. Each part of the system was a work of engineering in itself. The recoil, the lifting system, the axles, the stabilizers, the breech, and the locking mechanisms. A single miscalculation or casting error could turn the firing into catastrophe. Assembling the piece in the field also required a separate logistics ecosystem. The howitzer was transported in 2 sub-assemblies, the barrel and the cradle of the gun. Each part traveled separately on 6-wheeled trailers and required a special crane, the M2 crane, for positioning and clamping. A full crew involved 14 men operating in synchrony: gunners, loaders, crane operators, gunpowder handlers, section chief, and safety coordinators. On prepared ground, complete assembly could take up to 8 hours. With intensive training and combat experience, this time would drop to less than 4. The effort was worth every minute. The result was a gun capable of hitting, with a deviation of less than 20 meters, a fortified position more than 25,000 meters away, even in adverse weather conditions. It was a precision weapon dressed as a monster. But the real genius was not only in the piece, but in the ammunition. The projectiles used, model M112, came in 2 main configurations: explosive and concrete piercing. The first, filled with 49 pounds of TNT additivated with powdered aluminum, had a destructive radius increased by 40% compared to pure TNT. The second, intended to break casemates, had a hardened steel warhead, with a delay fuse, and a body designed to penetrate up to 2.5 meters of concrete before detonating. This millimeter interval between impact and explosion was the key, allowing the energy of the detonation to concentrate inside the structure, generating internal fractures called sympathetic fractures, a collapse pattern where the structure self-destructs from the inside out. Production began in November 1942 with 6 pilot units. In less than 12 months, the factory in Watervliet achieved a production rate of 13 guns per month. Each unit cost the equivalent of $380,000, the price of 12 Sherman tanks. And yet the U.S. Army authorized the manufacture of 315 pieces, supported by more than 100,000 shells stored in warehouses in England, France, and Italy. The doctrine was clear. The 240 milliliters wasn't a weapon for every day. It was for the days when nothing else worked. The day when a bunker needed to disappear from the map with a single impact. It is important to remember that in 1944, while the Germans were celebrating the entry into service of a new 200mm railway gun with equivalent range, but which needed rails, cranes, and days of preparation, the Americans had already positioned their first battalions of 240mm howitzers in the field, ready to fire in a matter of hours. It was the difference between artisanal power and industrial capacity, between the showcase weapon and the instrument of real war. In the summer of 1943, in a confidential U.S. Army memo, a general summed up the concept: "This weapon will not be used often, but when it is used, nothing should be left." The following year, in Anzio, this concept would cease to be a theory, because what was to come next wasn't an engineering exercise. It was the first real shot against a real bunker, with real men inside, and with it, the war of the fortifications would enter its terminal phase. The defensive line built to last decades would disappear in seconds, and the Germans would finally hear the sound of what they insisted on calling impossible. At dawn on January 28, 1944, the Italian coast seemed motionless. Dense fog and biting cold shrouded the makeshift port of Anzio, where the Allies had established a strategic beachhead just 50 kilometers from Rome. On the other side, over carefully fortified limestone hills, the German 29th Infantry Corps watched every move, protected by a continuous line of pillboxes, observation posts, and shelters interconnected by tunnels. These positions, some dug directly into the rock, others built with reinforced concrete up to 2 meters, were considered impregnable. German commanders confident in the doctrine of defense in depth knew that their positions dominated the plains and could hold off any land advance. They knew it, until that day. At 5:47 a.m., unannounced, the U.S. 697th Artillery Battalion began firing its newest piece, the 240mm M1. The target was an observation bunker with direct communications for German artillery, located on an elevation known to the Americans as Crow Post. The impact of the first projectile was not only explosive, it was seismic. The structure disappeared from the relief. There was no partial collapse, nor survivors to report the collapse. Only fragments of concrete and a void where there was once a tactical center. Allied observers, accustomed to recording results such as moderate damage or position disabled, reported target eliminated. It was a rare terminology, which indicated not only the functional destruction of the target, but the physical extinction of its existence. This firing was the first of many. Over the next 48 hours, the 240mm howitzers hit 9 other priority targets in the hills around Anzio, including ammunition dumps, pillboxes, and armored shelters. In each case, the pattern repeated itself. Direct impact, craters up to 5 meters deep, underground detonation, and total collapse of the structure. But the most relevant damage was not in the soil, it was in the mind. Military Intelligence Service, MIS, reports recorded radio intercepts between German units requesting immediate evacuation of fortified positions, even though they had not been hit. One commander even stated, "If this new cannon can pick any structure and make it disappear, then our concrete is worth nothing anymore." The 697th Battalion's campaign diary describes the psychological effect crudely. After the second day of firing, the Germans ceased their observation transmissions in the eastern hills. Our patrols reported abandonment of posts previously considered strategic. Enemy return fire became erratic and less frequent. It was the first time the U.S. Army had seen an artillery gun cause demoralization before it even broke through the lines. The technical impact of the M1 was clear, but its strategic value was even deeper. For the first time, an artillery piece had transformed a defense doctrine into pure vulnerability. Among the soldiers' reports, one name emerged: Headman Vera Hoffman, a radio operator with the 1st Observation Group, stationed at a nearby elevation. In his testimony after the campaign, he described the moment when the first 240mm projectile crossed the sky. There was no metallic sound, there was no hissing, just a displacement of air, and seconds later, a sound that seemed to come from inside the earth. So, silence. The bunker disappeared, as if it had never existed. Hoffman was not a poet, he was a technician, but his description accurately captured the rational terror that the new weapon inspired. It wasn't noisy, it was definitive. German soldiers began calling the impacts shadowless bombs, a nickname arising from the fact that shells arrived unseen, often fired from positions so far away that there was no visual signal. A minute earlier, there was confidence. A minute later, there was an absence. The bunkers ceased to be shelters and became sentences. What the Germans didn't know was that this was just one artillery battalion, with 6 pieces. 10 more battalions were being prepared in the rear, with expanded logistics and adjusted doctrine. The U.S. Army had tested the hammer, and was now preparing to use it methodically. The irony was brutal. While German engineers designed concrete fortresses based on static parameters, thickness, angle, dispersion, the Americans had designed a weapon specifically to break all these calculations. The War of the Fortifications, begun with foundations and mathematical confidence, was now fought with movable variables, field intelligence, and absolutely precise firepower. German doctrine was not only being overcome, it was being annulled. In the following months, the M1 would become a central piece in the destruction of other defensive lines, but it was in Anzio that its nickname among the artillerymen was born, the hammerer of fortresses, and the term was not hyperbole. It was engineering applied to the destruction of concepts, because after Anzio, no position was safe, and the maps of German fortifications, once proudly detailed, would now mark more craters than bunkers. But what would make the M1 truly unbeatable wasn't its power. It was the machine behind it, an industry that didn't sleep, a factory that didn't stop, and a system that turned every projectile into a sentence of ruin. In the next chapter, we will see how this logistical machinery, made up of workers, trains, ships, and mobile workshops, sustained the invisible force that the Germans could not understand. War as a serial product. In the heart of New York State, beside the Hudson River, there was a facility almost unknown outside military circles, the Watervliet Arsenal. Founded in 1813, the complex was quiet on the outside, but by 1943, its bowels echoed like a war powerhouse. 3 uninterrupted shifts, 7 days a week, more than 4,000 workers, most of them women. At the height of production, they were the ones who shaped, inspected, and calibrated every section of the 240mm M1's barrels with a precision that would make German engineers cringe. The difference between a successful shot and a structural failure was in fractions of a millimeter, and these fractions were conquered by civilian hands, in workshops that produced like factories but operated like watchmakers. Each howitzer required more than 50 critical components machined to microscopic tolerances. From the breech lock to the hydraulic recoil mechanism, everything was tested on vibrating benches, extreme heat furnaces, and impact chambers. A casting error invalidated the entire piece. But the chain did not stop. Instead of seeking improvised solutions, American arsenals designed reversible assembly lines. If one piece failed, another would follow in place, and production would continue. While German engineers sacrificed weeks to assemble a Gerät 040 railgun, the Americans produced 4 M1s a week, already packed with technical documentation, spare parts, and instructions for field assembly. War was treated as an industry, not as art. And it wasn't just the howitzer. Each shot needed a parallel structure. The 240mm ammunition could not be stacked like rifle cartridges. They were produced in specific facilities, with a process that involved forging hulls, filling with high-density explosive, and sealing by calibrated fuses. The total weight of each projectile exceeded 160 kilograms. Still, in just one quarter of 1944, the U.S. produced 41,000 units. To transport this arsenal, railway convoys, armored barges, and modified trucks with individual supports were adapted. Logistics so obsessive that it even foresaw the type of mud in which each unit would be unloaded. Meanwhile, Germany could barely keep up with the pace of standard munitions production, with factories under attack and transport routes disintegrated. The difference was in the principles. The Germans were looking for the extraordinary. Gigantic cannons, monstrous tanks, revolutionary weapons. But its production was artisanal, sporadic, often symbolic. The U.S., on the other hand, was looking for the functional. The 240mm M1 wasn't a marvel. It was a reliable, replicable, efficient instrument. An American gunner needed 4 rounds, not 40, to destroy a bunker. The secret wasn't the caliber, it was the method. Coordination with observers, updated maps, dispersion calculation, adjustment by topography and wind. American doctrine was clear. No fire was wasted, precision was applied. This mentality was also reflected in the countryside. The artillery battalions weighed tons, required dozens of men, and needed constant maintenance. But everything was foreseen. Mobile workshops accompanied the regiments, spare parts traveled along with ammunition, and manuals were illustrated with diagrams simple enough for any recruit to comprehend. The gun wasn't a technical secret, it was a collective tool. Each projectile fired was the result of thousands of previous logistical decisions, of contracts signed, of night shifts in artificially lit factories, of trains that crossed the continent without stopping. The war was not only won in the field, it was won on the assembly line. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. While German generals insisted on fixed shields, the U.S. invested in movable hammers. Instead of asking how to resist, Americans wondered how to destroy with less. And they found the answer in steel forged by civilians and fired by trained farmers. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content and keep the memory of this war engineering alive. The result was invisible until the moment of impact. But when the 240mm fired, the bunker ceased to be an obstacle and became a crater. In June 1944, during the offensive against the defenses of Montebourg in Normandy, the report of the 991st Battalion recorded a brutal fact. Objective hit with 3 shots, missing structure, enemy in retreat. A fortification designed to withstand hours of bombardment, erased in less than 5 minutes. And what the Germans didn't yet know, was that this pattern would repeat itself hundreds of times, because behind each howitzer there was not just one weapon. There was an entire country functioning as an engine of destruction, and in the next chapter we will see how this gear reached its apex, knocking down not only bunkers, but the entire lines of the most ambitious fortification ever built by Germany, the Siegfried Line. In early 1944, as the Allied armies traversed Italy and prepared for the invasion of France, a quiet revolution was taking place in the heart of every American heavy artillery battery. Unlike the Germans, who relied on prefixed coordinates and static maps, or the Soviets, who preferred to saturate areas with a brutal volume of fire, the Americans bet on an unprecedented concept of flexibility and accuracy. This concept was embodied in the FDC, the Fire Direction Center, the operational brain of each battery of 240 EMA-1 howitzers. It was not just a calculation post. It was a mobile ballistic intelligence station, connected to a living network of tactical, meteorological, and human data. In a typical FDC, 5 soldiers operated maps, rulers, fire sheets, radios, and weather instruments, in constant sync with forward observers in the field. When an observer spotted a target, a hidden bunker, a command position, he would trigger the protocol. Using SCR-610 radios, installed in backpacks or jeeps, the observer transmitted the initial coordinates, accompanied by visual descriptions and elevation estimates. The time between observation and calculation was less than 2 minutes. The FDC then sprang into action. The factors considered were numerous: distance, relative altitude, type of ammunition, ground conditions, air density, humidity, ambient temperature, wind direction, and strength in different atmospheric layers. With each shot, the team recalibrated the data, adjusting the aim to the millimeter. A bunker 14 kilometers away could be reached with a detour of less than 15 meters. In the open field, this was lethal. In fortifications, where the margin between survival and structural collapse was centimeters, it was definitive. Most remarkable was the speed. A target could be identified and destroyed in less than 4 minutes. Not coincidentally, Wehrmacht reports in 1944 describe almost immediate American responses after any troop movement, suggesting an almost premonitory ability to locate them. The secret was not in the magic, it was in the calculations and in the radio cables. This approach was in direct contrast to German doctrine, where artillery was tied to hierarchical rigor and dependent on formal orders for fire adjustment. In many Wehrmacht units, observers did not have the autonomy to request direct fire. They only reported. The result was slowness and lack of adaptation. While a German officer was waiting for clearance to bomb a suspicious position, the American FDC had already fired, adjusted, and confirmed the destruction of the target. And if the shot missed, it didn't miss for long. The correction was instantaneous, based on real-time observation and not on theoretical spreadsheets. The system worked like an organism: eyes on the front line, brains on the FDC, muscles on the 240mm howitzers. The complexity did not stop there. The U.S. Army implemented mobile weather stations that transmitted updated atmospheric data every 3 hours to artillery units. The influence of air density on the trajectory of a 360-pound projectile, over 25 kilometers, could cause variations of up to 70 meters. With the adjustments applied, this deviation was reduced to less than 20. In one of the operations against the Gothic Line in Italy, an observer reported the presence of a bunker partially camouflaged with vegetation. The FDC processed the coordinates with 3 layers of ballistic correction, sent the data to the guns, and in 2 shots the position disappeared. The bunker had not even been mapped by the Allies, but it was eliminated based on field observation and immediate reaction. War ceased to be static and became responsive. This level of integration between man, machine, and mathematics was unprecedented, and the impact was profound. The defensive positions, once protected by miles of distance and yards of concrete, were now vulnerable to an enemy who did not need to see them with his own eyes to destroy them. It was enough for someone somewhere with a radio and binoculars to know where they were. That was the real revolution. Not the power of the explosion, but the intelligence behind it. It was a thinking artillery, coordinated in real time, with decentralized decisions adjusted according to the field, and not according to the manual. The Germans did not know this. and so they continued to build defenses as if they were still in 1916. While German doctrine provided for preemptive barrages of fire, American forces preferred the concept of shot of opportunity, adjusted to actual enemy movement. It was no longer necessary to destroy everything around it. It was necessary to hit only the exact point. Instead of spending 1,000 shells to cut off one sector, the Americans spent 5 to eliminate the heart of the resistance, and they eliminated with surgical precision. A command bunker, 4 shots. An underground ammunition depot, 3. A communications hub, 2. The Germans were prepared to resist the volume, but they were not prepared to disappear without warning. The FDC didn't just increase artillery efficiency, it turned time into a strategic advantage. The time between detecting and destroying was so short that Axis soldiers could not react. Many did not even know they were under observation until they heard the impact, and when they heard it, it was too late. A diary recovered from a German officer in Metz, France, described the feeling with disturbing accuracy. They don't fire like we do, they wait, and when they shoot, they don't miss. This phrase, found between pages covered in dirt and blood, reveals what cold numbers often hide: the moral disorientation caused by an enemy who fights not with brute force, but with ruthless calculation. Behind the scenes of this precision, there was another element even more invisible, but equally decisive: human computers. Teams trained only to solve in seconds complex ballistic equations with slide rules and logarithmic tables. Each shot was a living equation, solved in trenches with pencil, paper, and urgency. A science of war practiced by ordinary men, trained to make time a weapon. And what the Germans would learn, the hard way, is that this weapon, when finely tuned, was more lethal than any rocket or flying bomb. Because it didn't terrorize, it just erased. In the next chapter, we will see what happens when this precision meets the most symbolic of Nazi fortifications, the West Wall, or Siegfried Line, and how in the face of the calculated artillery of the Americans, the concrete became only geology. On the Western Front between September and December 1944, the German army began to register an alarming phenomenon: entire fortifications being abandoned by their garrisons before the first enemy fire. It was not a question of mass desertion or panic caused by advancing tanks. The enemy was dozens of kilometers away. But there was something invisible that made men refuse shelter, defy direct orders, and in extreme cases, opt for voluntary death. That something was the 240-meter M1 howitzer, and in Wehrmacht reports, it wasn't mentioned by its technical name. It was called an earthquake grenade, a silent hammer, or simply the sound that comes from nowhere. Documents captured by Allied forces, now archived at Fort Belvoir, reveal the extent of the psychological breakdown. In a letter written by a company commander stationed in the Ardennes, it reads, "It is not the impact that terrifies. It's the weight. It's knowing that, somewhere, someone saw you, and that now it's a matter of minutes. No wall is enough." This testimony is repeated in other sources. A campaign diary, found in the ruins of a destroyed bunker near Aachen, bore the notation, "They shoot once. If they make a mistake, they get it right on Monday, and there is no third chance." The author, later identified as Hauptmann Franz Lütke, did not survive the next day. The German perception of the M1 was not just of a powerful weapon, it was from an impersonal entity. Unlike aerial bombardments, which came with increasing noise, sirens, and the possibility of evasion, the shots from the 240mm howitzer arrived in silence. The projectile was fired at more than 600 meters per second and did not emit the classic fall whistle. Its approach was marked only by a sudden displacement of air, followed by an explosion that did not reverberate, but reverberated within. The shock wave invaded the ears, the entrails, the bone structures. It was a physical experience, not just an auditory one. Soldiers who survived close gunfire reported hearing loss, disorientation, and in some cases, temporary paralysis. A German medical report classified the symptoms as neurosomatic effects of unanticipated explosions in fortified spaces, a technical way of saying, the sound of the howitzer went mad. In interrogations conducted after the war, officers of the Siegfried Line confessed to altering their positioning routines for fear of the new artillery. A colonel of the 65th Regiment stated, "We started to use tents in open fields instead of pillboxes. The chance of survival was greater on the outside. It was the complete reversal of German doctrine. Concrete, designed to protect, was now seen as a death trap. This directly affected discipline and the chain of command. Orders to reinforce fixed positions were ignored or sabotaged. In October 1944, in the Saarbrücken sector, 3 quartermaster officers requested the voluntary destruction of their own bunkers, claiming that staying in them would be inevitable suicide. The request was denied. Days later, the 3 were found dead from an internal explosion. No external impact had been recorded. The fortification had become a tomb. This silent dread began to be reflected in the field orders. The 7th Infantry Division ordered that pillboxes should only be occupied as a last resort. The 275th recommended to its officers not to establish command posts in fixed structures, and the 12th Panzer Division instituted a new directive. Mobility is life. A fixed position is death. Such phrases, unthinkable 2 years earlier, have become mantras of survival. The doctrine of the static fortress was crumbling not by the direct force of the enemy, but by its ability to choose, with mathematical exactitude, where and when to collapse the world around it. The psychological effect was amplified by the absence of warning. There were no planes in the sky, no columns of tanks advancing, no smoke screens. Just silence, coordinates, and impact. For the German soldier, this broke the logic of war. The enemy, invisible and distant, could extinguish a bunker as if blowing out a candle. In words recorded by a lieutenant in the defensive line at Hürtgen, "They don't confront us, they watch us, and then they replace us with a hole." Fear was no longer a human resource, it became a structural component. It was embedded in the concrete, in the beams, in the walls that shook without noise. The statistics reflect this moral corrosion. In sectors hit by 240 meters artillery, the abandonment of positions increased by up to 300% compared to unreached areas. In battalions subjected to more than 10 impacts, the rates of disciplinary collapse doubled. And most tellingly, in at least 5 documented cases, Reich engineering soldiers sabotaged their own structures before the enemy's arrival, opening escape passages or disabling defense circuits, not because of betrayal, but because of the certainty of uselessness. This invisible war, made of precision and absence, generated lasting effects. Even after the end of hostilities, German veterans avoided talking about the impacts of the howitzer. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of something that German doctrine refused to admit, that the war had changed, that it was no longer enough to have the best engineer or the densest concrete. It was necessary to have mobility, intelligence, data network, and above all, the ability to react faster than the other thinks. And this the Americans had on an industrial scale. But the most symbolic episode of this inversion of logic was yet to come. At the heart of the Siegfried Line, a fortress considered impassable, the command bunker of the Stolberg sector, would be hit by only 4 shells. And it wouldn't just fall, it would be erased from the topography. In the next chapter, we will see how this particular destruction caused a domino effect throughout the German rear, collapsing positions before they were even attacked. Because sometimes, all it takes is a sure impact to destroy an entire doctrine. In July 1944, the landscape of Saint-Lô in Normandy resembled a city after the end of the world. Ruins, craters, wires hanging from charred poles. What had once been a vital logistical center for the German army was now the scene of an engineering battle against geography. High on the surrounding hills, sheltered on inverted slopes and carefully dug to withstand aerial bombardment, were the last bunkers that supported the Wehrmacht's containment line. Allied air attacks had failed to neutralize them. The angle of impact was unfavorable, and the structures, protected by landmass and oblique angles, survived even waves of heavy bombs. But what German strategists did not yet understand was that the enemy did not need an angle. It just needed time. In preparation for Operation Cobra, the offensive aimed at breaking the encirclement around the American beachhead, the Allied command ordered the deployment of 4 batteries equipped with 240 mm M1s. Its parts were installed almost 20 kilometers from the front, hidden among forests and supplied by a logistics line that moved with clockwork precision. Each howitzer operated with forward observers positioned at elevated points and connected by SCR 610 radios. The target, underground bunkers used as communication centers and machine gun emplacements. They would not be attacked by Air Force. They would be extinguished one by one with curved fire in silence. The Germans had underestimated the concept of high-precision artillery at long range. In St. Lo's defensive plan, drawn up in April 1944, the fortresses were listed as invulnerable to indirect fire below 2 and 3 mm. The M1 fired 240 mm shells with an explosive charge of 53 kilograms. The difference of 37 mm, which would seem technical to a layman, meant, in practice, the ability to break through reinforced concrete with just one impact. In 3 days, more than 40 fixed positions were reached. Of these, 36 were classified as permanently neutralized. The American artillery did not seek victory by saturation. It sought precision with the final result. A well-hit bunker would not operate again. Never. The impact on German morale was immediate. General Richard Schey, in charge of the defense of the sector, recorded in his diary, "We lost 5 positions yesterday. None were invaded. All were destroyed from a distance. There is no defense against that." His words were confirmed in the intercepted reports. Paratrooper units, known for their iron discipline, began to abandon their posts without authorization. In a single day, 97 soldiers of the 5th Paratrooper Division were picked up unarmed, wandering out of position, stating that there was no more reason to fight in caves. The doctrine of resistance to the last man had been shattered by a new equation of combat: visibility plus mathematics plus steel, tactical nullification. The bunkers of the inverted slopes, considered jewels of defensive engineering, became geological traps. As the impact of the 240 mm was vertical, its penetration was more effective than any side aerial bomb. A bunker near Hill 192, buried under 4 meters of earth and concrete, was obliterated with 2 shots. One of the survivors, questioned days later, stated, "I heard a muffled sound. The ceiling opened. When I woke up, there was no roof anymore." The moral effect was devastating because it removed the only remaining point of confidence: structural soundness. The fortification was no longer a refuge. It was a sentence. At this point in the war, industrial difference became a constant shadow over German decisions. In simple terms, the U.S. produced more than 25 times the volume of heavy artillery ammunition than the Reich in 1944. The production of 240 mm howitzers, even with all their complexity, exceeded the rates of any equivalent shell in the German arsenal, and that's without considering technical support, parts replacement, and the supply chain. Germany relied on individual genius. The U.S. relied on synchronized assembly lines. Pause for a fact. While the Germans produced an average of 18 heavy howitzers per month in 1944, the Americans produced 72 units of the M1 model alone. If this data surprised you, comment below with "Logistics wins," because in modern war it really wins. With the destruction of the last strongholds of St. Lo, Operation Cobra found the corridor it needed. The in-depth advance has begun, but it wasn't the number of troops that made the flank crumble. It was the absence of a rearguard. The command posts had been pulverized. The radio centers were mute. Supply positions turned to ashes. The offensive met with no resistance. He found vacuums. Heavy precision artillery had dismantled the line from the inside, like a surgeon cutting arteries before the final blow. There was no room for counterattack. The German line at St. Lo collapsed without direct confrontation. The force was not that of tanks nor of infantry. It was that of ballistic calculation. General Bradley, in a later interview, stated, "They expected a frontal assault. They gave us concrete. We gave them engineering." The phrase, which seems simple, captures the essence of the turnaround. Germany struggled with the logic of the First World War. The U.S. fought with wind and topography algorithms. While one side stacked soldiers in trenches, the other piled up data, calibrated ammunition, and ruler and radio observers. But the full implementation of M1 would still have its peak, because if St. Lo showed the efficiency of the weapon against hidden positions, the next chapter would show its use against the ultimate symbol of German defensive arrogance, Stolberg's fortress, a structure so deep, so protected, that it was considered proof of any attack, until he received his 4th shot. And it disappeared. In the Italian Apennines between August and October 1944, Germany made its last big bet on geography as a weapon. The Gothic Line, carved along hundreds of kilometers of mountain ranges, was built with an almost mystical certainty. That relief would finally give the Reich the ultimate shield. Rugged peaks, narrow valleys, dense forests. The terrain was treacherous for tanks, exposed for infantry, and challenging even for aerial bombardments. At first glance, it seemed impossible to break through that wall without paying the price of a generation. But what the German generals did not understand is that the Americans did not plan to escalate. They were going to aim from below and destroy from afar. It was against this backdrop that the 240mm M1 found a new purpose, no longer just knocking down bunkers, but redefining the idea of defensive advantage. The American batteries were positioned in the valleys, hidden by vegetation and topography. Using precision ballistic maps and refined weather calculations, the FDCs adjusted firing angles to overshoot ridges and hit invisible targets, literally bending fire into 25-kilometer parabolas. It was as if the sky served as a tunnel. The first impacts came in September, during the offensive on Mount Altuso. A command bunker, camouflaged in a natural cavity and reinforced with 3 meters of reinforced concrete, disappeared after 3 shots. No plane had located him. No troops had touched him. Only an observer with binoculars, on an adjacent hill, had transmitted his coordinates. The offensive against the Gothic Line was a lesson in quiet tactics. Instead of pushing with brute force, the Americans collapsed specific points with absolute precision. The terrain, which had previously hampered aerial bombardments, now protected American pieces from enemy reconnaissance. Heavy artillery, hidden in clearings and camouflaged roads, operated with almost total invisibility. The Germans did not know where the shots were coming from. They only knew that they were coming, and that when they arrived, it was too late. Morale, already shaky, began to disintegrate. Veteran troops of the 1st Mountain Division, considered elite among the Alpines, reported bouts of panic after successive losses in intact fortifications. In a radio intercept, a German operator described, "It looks like they shoot through the mountains. We have nowhere else to hide." The German doctrine based on the control of the high ground was subverted by a technical concept that was not included in their manuals: the mastery of the angle. The possibility of attacking a buried, protected, invisible target, based solely on calculation and communication, was something that Reich engineering did not foresee. Their tactical maps did not consider the curved fire artillery factor in high accuracy. When faced with the new reality, they tried to improvise. They reinforced entrances, expanded excavations, multiplied camouflage, but none of these measures altered the fact that American artillery did not need to see. It was enough to know, and she always knew. In one of the most symbolic operations of the campaign, the central bunker of the fortification at Monte Battaglia, built over 5 months with layers of rock, steel, and cast concrete, was destroyed in 6 minutes by 2 howitzers. The first shot hit the ventilation section. The second went through the upper slab and detonated inside. The structure collapsed on its occupants. The irony? No American units had seen the bunker. The target was detected by thermal microvariations picked up by aerial reconnaissance and confirmed by intercepted radio signals. The M1 was just the messenger. The message was simple: neither time, nor stone, nor altitude will save you if your enemy can turn math into artillery. More than physical destruction, what collapsed was faith. Faith in the concrete, in the altitude, in the doctrine inherited from the First World War. The mountains, which were supposed to delay the Allies for months, were crossed in weeks. The advance was not linear, nor spectacular. It was methodical. Each position eliminated meant dozens of meters conquered without direct confrontation. A neutralized bunker saved hundreds of lives. The U.S. Army understood this like few others. Progress was measured in silences. The silences that came after the impacts, when no radio responded, when no garrison survived to retreat. This is the thesis that closes the first arc of this story. Neither terrain nor concrete nor technical pride were sufficient in the face of a force that combined precision engineering, continuous logistics, and an adaptable doctrine. The war, which Germany planned to wage with tradition and position, was won with innovation and mobility. And what makes this all the more shocking is that the weapon used for such a victory was one of the slowest, heaviest, and most static in the American arsenal. But she was also the smartest. And if even the mountains were defeated, what was left for Germany? The answer begins to emerge in the next pages of history, when German commanders, no longer having faith in the concrete, try to appeal to the impossible, the counteroffensive. But once again, what awaited them was not confrontation. It was the silence before the impact. The Siegfried Line, or West Wall, as it was known to the Germans themselves, stretched over 630 kilometers of fortified border. It was, according to Third Reich propaganda, the ultimate wall against any Western invasion. A chain of more than 18,000 defensive structures of bunkers, pillboxes, dragon teeth, and artillery positions buried in reinforced concrete. The project, which began in the 1930s and intensified from 1938 onwards, had mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers under the coordination of the Todt organization. Every block, every observation tower, every armored trench represented years of meticulous engineering, based on the concept of obstacle saturation defense. German pride was visible even in the manuals. Type 10 bunkers featured external walls up to 2.5 meters thick, internal chambers separated by ballistic steel doors, and ventilation systems designed to resist gases and pressure. It was more than defense. It was an ideological statement. For Hitler, the Siegfried Line was material proof that the Reich was insurmountable. But there was a problem. The Germans had designed the line to withstand what they knew: conventional field artillery, tanks, tactical explosives. They did not anticipate that they would face a weapon that not only exceeded all previous calibers, but was intelligence-driven, radio-coordinated, and underpinned by an industry capable of operating as a real-time logistical organism. When the first 240-meter M1s were positioned on the Western Front, on the outskirts of Monschau and Zweibrücken, the German commanders didn't even know what they were up against. The impacts were too precise, the destructive power was too high, and the response, non-existent. The American operation against the Siegfried Line was meticulously planned. Using aerial reconnaissance data, high-altitude photos, and espionage reports accumulated since 1942, the Allies mapped each critical segment of the line. Instead of attacking it head-on, the U.S. isolated logistical nodes, eliminated command centers, and severed internal connections. The M1 was the key to opening the gates. In October 1944, during the offensive against the Type 117A casemate, considered one of the toughest in the entire system, 3 240-meter rounds were enough to implode the central structure and render the adjacent ammunition rooms unusable. The impact reverberated far beyond the concrete. For the first time, Germans were watching, in real time, the disintegration of a symbol. What had taken years to build was being erased in minutes. The reports of the Allied command did not use adjectives. They used numbers. A single artillery battalion equipped with M1 managed to neutralize 27 fortifications in less than 72 hours. The average, 3.8 shots per bunker. The unusable rate, over 80%. What most surprised the military observers was the regularity of the collapse. These were not random attacks. Each impact was the result of an equation: latitude, longitude, angle, wind, concrete density, soil type. The howitzer wasn't just force, it was applied science. And this is what destabilized the German High Command. Internal reports of the Wehrmacht, now archived in Freiburg, reveal the technical panic. An engineering colonel wrote, "Most of our bunkers are being hit at exactly the points of greatest structural stress. They know where to aim, and they get it right." Another document, signed by a sector commander, acknowledges, "We have no answer. The line that should defend us is exposing us. It has become a strategic trap." The perception spread. In entire sectors, bunkers were abandoned preemptively. The mere fact that a position was within the estimated range of the M1 was enough for its evacuation. The defensive doctrine, built on resistance, collapsed without the enemy even crossing the line. The case of the Birkengarten fortress exemplifies the psychological impact of the offensive. Designed as a regional command center, with 5 underground floors and an autonomous power system, it was hit on November 9, 1944 by 4 shots. No aerial bomb had even managed to scratch its structure, but the American howitzers, guided by infiltrated observers and very high-precision ballistic calculations, pierced the upper layers and detonated the lower levels in sequence. There was no structure left to be recovered. Radio silence for more than 36 hours prompted the Wehrmacht to declare the fortress a total loss with no survivors. The bunker, a symbol of invulnerability, had become a crater. More shocking than the destruction was the speed. By November 1944, just 40 days into the campaign against the Siegfried Line, more than 1,000 fortifications had been deemed unusable. In 120 days, this number would exceed 3,800. At no time did the U.S. use mass bombardments against these structures. Most of the losses were caused by less than 5% of the total Allied artillery rounds, all 240mm, all surgical. This data in itself dismantles the idea that the war of attrition was inevitable. What occurred was an engineering war, and the Americans won because they didn't want to outdo the Reich in the field of brutality. They wanted to outdo it in the equation. And here comes the final contrast of this stage. Germany had invested millions of man-hours, thousands of tons of concrete, steel, and forced labor to erect a line that, in theory, was supposed to stop the West for years. But it only took a handful of artillery pieces, well-planned, well-operated, well-positioned, to crumble all that illusion. Engineering, which was the pride of the Reich, became his grave. Because, as a British analyst wrote at the time, the wall that does not move will always be destroyed by those who know where to hit. And if this impact seems absolute, we have not yet seen the apex. Because while the Germans were trying to understand how their fortress fell, the Americans were already preparing a mobile, compact version of that power, the fast-moving artillery. In the next chapter, we will discover how an even more agile and adaptable weapon would do what even the most pessimistic generals of the Reich did not foresee: bring the fear of the 240mm into the heart of the Ardennes forest. From the winter of 1944, something strange began to be noticed in German operational reports: empty bunkers. Not by the direct action of the American infantry, but by the previous abandonment of the German garrisons. Entire fortifications, intact, with no signs of combat, were found open, with equipment left behind, radios still tuned and logbooks with the last words hastily written: "I can't do it anymore." The Wehrmacht's high commands, accustomed to measuring losses in terms of material and territory, were forced to deal with a new kind of casualty: collapsed morale. Soldiers trained to resist to the end, indoctrinated under the principle of obedience to the Führer, were refusing to enter the bunkers, not out of cowardice, but out of trauma, by an invisible fear that grew with each 240mm explosion. The destruction caused by the American howitzers had an unprecedented component. It was invisible until the moment of impact. There was no air alert, no approach of armored vehicles, no exchange of fire, only the dull and deep sound of the shot, followed by seconds of silence, and then a shockwave that ripped steel doors off their hinges, cracked concrete slabs as if they were plaster, and sent men crashing into walls with the force of a locomotive. The survivors didn't talk about the explosion. They talked about the vibration, the sound that made the ground tremble, that passed through the chest and paralyzed the muscles. The 240mm artillery didn't just destroy. She warned that she would come, and that was enough to break the mind. Allied intelligence reports intercepted communications between German units reporting a phenomenon then dubbed bunker Krankheit, the bunker disease. It was described as a state of extreme anxiety, accompanied by sweating, tremors, insomnia, and auditory hallucinations. In a panzer division stationed in the Ardennes, more than 200 soldiers were turned away with similar symptoms after a series of howitzer impacts. Field medics recorded cases of men who refused to descend stairs to underground bunkers, even under threat of court-martial. One of them, interrogated days later by the Americans, declared, "I prefer to die in the open. At least I see the sky. That sound does not come from the sky. It comes from the earth, and it's breaking." The technical superiority of the U.S. created a side effect that the planners themselves had not foreseen: the psychological emptying of the enemy before direct confrontation. The original purpose of the M1 was to destroy fortifications, but on the field, he destroyed convictions. German confidence in the solidity of concrete was not just strategic, it was spiritual. The bunker was the last refuge, the place where one resisted, where one fought to the end. When this symbol was torn away, what was left was emptiness, a void that spread to the most experienced divisions. The 212th Infantry Division, a veteran of the Eastern Front, recorded a wave of transfer requests after a week under 240 mm bombardment. One officer wrote, "My men have nowhere else to hide, nor where to trust." American logic was cruel in its efficiency. By attacking the nerve centers of German defense, commands, warehouses, communications, the M1 not only disorganized the rear, he reprogrammed the front line. The German soldier entering a bunker no longer saw a defensive position. He saw a tomb. Trench psychology has been replaced by waiting psychology. Wait for the sound. Wait for the impact. Waiting for the ceiling to collapse without warning. Death, once associated with direct combat, now came in silence. And the mind in this scenario became the first breaking point. In a letter intercepted by British intelligence, an officer in the German 7th Army wrote to his wife, "There is no battle, just calculation. They know where we are. You know how long we will stay. And they shoot as if they had read our plans." The accuracy of the howitzers, coupled with the ability of the American FDCs to respond quickly to changes in the field, created an environment of absolute unpredictability. There was no safe zone. There was no routine. Moving between bunkers became Russian roulette. A supply truck hit by a single 240 mm shot was found with the bodies still sitting, with their hands on the steering wheels, frozen at the moment of impact. The heavy artillery had outgrown the battlefield dimension. Now, she attacked the imaginary. German morale collapse was measured in quiet desertions, in battalions that retreated before the first rifle shot. Across entire stretches of the Siegfried Line, units disappeared without a trace of combat. They just left. The destruction was not visible in trenches or charred tanks. It was visible in the abandonment. The U.S. Army began to advance through supposedly fortified areas without encountering resistance. When they did, it was disorganized, improvised, without command. The psychological impact of the M1 was so profound that German artillery units began to hide their positions in forests without cover, just to avoid being associated with any fixed structure. The doctrine that valued organization now called for dispersion, desperation disguised as tactics. This domino effect reached even the highest levels of the German command. In the diary of a general of Army Group B, a note from December 1944 reads, "We are fighting an enemy that does not confront us, dismantles us, an enemy who thinks in equations, not glory." This realization sealed what was left of the spirit of resistance in the fixed lines. Because glory for the German soldier has always been linked to heroic defense, to the last shot, to the last grenade. But how to resist what is not seen? How to face the calculation? How to fight back against a number moving at 800 meters per second? And if psychological terror had already infiltrated every fortification of the Reich, what would come next would take that fear to another level. Because Americans were not satisfied with just mastering concrete. They were about to turn precision artillery into a systematic method of urban destruction. And the next target wasn't an isolated bunker on a hill. It was an entire city. While Germany dreamed of weapons with a mythical effect, the United States delivered serial accuracy, on time. This was the real war that was fought behind the trenches, not that of the cannons but that of the spreadsheets. The Third Reich staked its fate on extraordinary solutions. 600 mm railway howitzers like the Karl Gerät, operated by hundreds of men and requiring dedicated tracks. Guns that fired once a day and could only be moved with civil engineers and specialized cranes. The U.S. made another choice: standardization, efficiency, scale. The 240 mm M1 howitzer wasn't a miracle weapon, it was a tool. And for that very reason, it was deadlier than any single piece of German engineering. Its production was constant, its maintenance was simple, its ammunition was interchangeable, and its logistics were predictable. While the Reich built legends, Americans built systems. The Watervliet Arsenal in New York produced more than 330 units of the M1 between 1943 and 1945, accompanied by tens of thousands of 360-pound shells. Each unit was accompanied by M6 tractors, M2 cranes, support vehicles, maintenance tents, spare parts, and trained staff. The operating manuals detailed each process from landing to shooting, standardizing performance in the field. The average time between target detection and the first shot was less than 12 minutes, in any weather, on any front. That wasn't the power of a cannon. It was the power of a supply chain that worked like an orchestra. Meanwhile, in Germany, the war effort was sinking into one-off solutions. Large guns, such as the Dora and Schwerer Gustav, required weeks of preparation and could only be used on a few fronts. The ammunition, produced in small batches, could not be replaced, and each damaged unit was practically an irreparable loss. In 1944, Albert Speer himself admitted, "We lost the war not because of the caliber of our weapons, but because of the impossibility of repeating them." The Luftwaffe, with its revolutionary jets, suffered from the same limitation: scarce parts, irregular production, incomplete training. The German doctrine bet on the miracle. The American doctrine bet on the method. And the method worked because the rhythm was unbreakable. In the middle of the war, the U.S. produced more than 4,000 trucks a week. Their logistical convoys crossed continents with parts, ammunition, tools, and fuel. Mobile workshops accompanied the artillery units, capable of repairing a damaged M1 in less than 24 hours. While Germany was forced to cannibalize parts between units, the U.S. treated each howitzer as replaceable. This logic of maintenance, where nothing was irreplaceable, everything was replicable, allowed the U.S. Army to maintain its cadence even after casualties and damage. A battery could lose a part and continue operating. The operation was the priority, not the equipment. Here it is worth pausing for a fact that the Germans themselves ignored. In 1944, the monthly American production of heavy artillery shells exceeded Germany's total capacity by 18 times. The Reich produced about 11,000 heavy shells per month. The USA, more than 200,000. If this impresses you, write in the comments. Logistics wins. Because that's exactly what happened. It was not brute force that overcame the German wall. It was the repetition. Predictable, constant, unbearable. The philosophy behind the M1 illustrates this contrast. Unlike the German monsters, which required heroes to operate them, the M1 was designed to be operated by ordinary men with standardized training. Its high-drop pneumatic recoil system, slewing rail, and lift control could be mastered by rotating crews in no time. Shot calculations were performed on mobile centers that tracked the advance of the front, using uniformed firing boards for all howitzers. This means that any part could be replaced at any point on the front. Efficiency wasn't in the metal. It was in the manual. This principle was even reflected in the ammunition. The 240mm shells followed a fixed mounting and storage pattern. Boxes with interchangeable components, modular fuses, staggered stocks. American logistics created redundancy at all levels. Nothing was unique. Everything was replaceable. While Germany buried weeks of work in a single 600mm gun, the U.S. put 5 operational M1s on the line and stockpiled ammunition for a full month of combat. It was a war of planning, and it was being won on the blackboards of the factories. The result of this philosophy was devastating. The Germans faced an enemy that didn't just reappear after each loss, it was already there. Double. If one piece was destroyed, 2 new ones were already in transit. If one position was neutralized, another battery was already positioned 10 kilometers away. American howitzers were not the spearhead. They were the production line in the field. And this completely undermined the Reich's logic of containment. Because how to contain a force that multiplies? How do you hold off artillery that fires, reloads, moves, and returns, all before the enemy can detect its source? The Americans did not seek the spectacle. They were looking for statistics. The doctrine behind the M1 was not to win with strength. It was to win with constancy. And while the Germans wondered how to stop a single 240mm shot, the Americans were already preparing the 100th. That is what defeated Germany. Not firepower, but pace. The ability to maintain the same shot, the same accuracy, the same impact, day after day, face after front, bunker after bunker. And if the M1 was the symbol of this process, its greatest strength was yet to come. Because the Americans now planned to apply this same logic of repetition and precision in urban environments. The next phase of the war would not be fought in the forests or mountains, but in the cities of the German countryside. And when concrete ceased to be a shelter but became a trap, the Reich saw not only its fortresses collapse, but their own streets. When the 240mm howitzers crossed the Rhine, Germany knew that it was not just facing a military invasion, it was facing the physical collapse of its history. Cities such as Metz, Nuremberg, and Aschaffenburg, once jewels of medieval architecture and pride of Germanic tradition, were hastily transformed into urban fortresses, not out of strategy, but out of desperation. The orders came directly from the high command. Resist at any cost, turn every street into a trench, every public building into a bunker. Churches, town halls, schools, and libraries were reinforced with concrete, sandbags, and barricades. The stained glass windows gave way to machine guns, the pulpits to observation posts, and in the medieval caves of the stone cellars, ammunition warehouses and field radios replaced the historical archives. The thousand-year empire, now reduced to a network of defensive ruins, trusted that the past would be its shield. But against American accuracy, not even the stones of history have stood up. In Metz, the German resistance believed it had a chance. The city, surrounded by centuries-old fortifications modernized by the Todt organization, had elevated positions, cross-firing ranges, and thick walls. But in November 1944, when the first 240mm shots hit the fortified compound of Fort Jeanne d'Arc, the illusion of security evaporated. A single impact destroyed 3 levels of the structure, burying the corridors and silencing the radio stations. The American infantry advanced not through the gates, but through the holes. Concrete did not prevent the advance. It only slowed down the collapse. In Nuremberg, the city that symbolized Nazism, the effort was even more desperate. Armaments factories were converted into vertical bunkers. Church towers served as observation points, and the imperial castle, pride of Teutonic tradition, became a resistance barracks. But against American logic, altitude was irrelevant. The 240mm pieces were positioned on the outskirts of the city, and with detailed maps and forward observers, began the systematic demolition of the strategic points. One by one, the buildings collapsed with precise impacts, each shot opening a penetration corridor for the infantry. Instead of breaking through the defenses, the Americans erased them. In Aschaffenburg, the theater of resistance was even more symbolic. The city, surrounded by forests and bathed by the River Main, had prepared to resist to the end. SS officers had vowed to turn the area into a bastion. More than 1,000 fighters were allocated to defensive positions in historic buildings. Every window turned into a firing point, every alley mined. But on March 26, 1945, a single 200mm shell hit the west wing of Schloss Johannesburg, the Renaissance castle that had been turned into a command center. The impact went through 3 walls and exploded in the main hall, killing 31 officers in a single instant. The city surrendered 2 days later. What centuries of history had built, American industrial artillery undid in minutes. This was the new face of war. Precision over glory, calculation over tradition. German cities, designed to withstand medieval siege, were not designed to withstand 160-killer projectiles traveling at more than 800 meters per second, and the Americans knew it. Howitzers were used sparingly, not at dams but at key points, such as keys that turned entire doors. One shot hit a turret, another, the communications center, a third, the withdrawal line. Before long, the defenses collapsed before they were even tested. The American manuals of the time indicated the ideal order of targets in an urban environment: observers, communications, deposits, morale. Yes, moral. Because after the first impacts, the German forces abandoned entire buildings. Aware that the next shot could hit exactly where they were, there was no longer any way to predict. The war, which had previously been conducted with hand-drawn tactical maps, now relied on air intelligence, ballistic calculation, and millimetrically guided indirect fire. And for the Germans, this was tantamount to fighting an invisible enemy, one that didn't smear its boots with mud, but demolished the city brick by brick. Reports captured after the fall of Frankfurt revealed the tactical desperation. Enemy artillery does not target our flanks. It cuts us into slices. Before we can respond, we are already isolated. That was the nature of the American advance. Not a tsunami, but a scalpel. The infantry followed behind the sound. Where the concrete gave way, the flag went up, and when the defenses crumbled, there was no bravery left. Silence remained. This process did not even spare the symbology. In Nuremberg, the Palace of Justice, where years later the crimes of the Reich would be tried, was hit by 3 240mm shots, not with the aim of destroying it completely, but of rendering its internal structures useless. The objective was surgical. It was technical, but the effect was symbolic. The idea of historical invulnerability, that German cities would resist because they were too valuable, was crushed by American logic. If it is an obstacle, it will be removed, history or not. And this logic would continue to advance, because the next stage would no longer be about bunkers or fortified cities. It would be about the doctrine behind all of this. The Americans were ready to directly confront the central belief of German defense, that sacrifice and determination could overcome any enemy. And what was about to happen on the Rhine bridges would prove that, against calculation, even fanaticism was not enough. The post-war archives reveal more than lost positions. They reveal shattered perceptions. For many German officers, the real collapse was not territorial, but psychological. The enemy they had trained to face was another, the hesitant American soldier with no military tradition, dependent on industry. But what emerged on the battlefield in 1944 was something that no Prussian playbook had predicted: an invisible enemy, silent until the moment of impact, and mathematically lethal. The diary of Oberstleutnant Horst Weidemann, captured in April 1945 in the Eifel region, accurately describes this dissonance. We expected sheep. We face engineers. No position is safe. Our maps are wrong before they're even used. This was the most painful reconfiguration of the war for the German officers, discovering that while they repeated doctrines inherited from Verdun, the Americans operated under updated equations with each mission. Among the memos rescued from the 11th Panzer Division, an internal report classifies the 240mm howitzer attacks as acts of immediate dematerialization. The terminology, initially used in a sarcastic tone, was eventually adopted as a standard. Dematerialization became the code among officers to describe the sudden and inexplicable loss of a position, without invasion, without warning, just the smoldering crater that remained in the place where there was a bunker. The radios were muted. Maps became obsolete. The escape routes, impassable. For an army that preached order, repetition, and absolute control of the terrain, this American unpredictability was the greatest terror. Generalleutnant Hans Buch Behrens, in a 1952 interview with British researchers, stated, "We were never taught that silence could kill. We were always told that the enemy would attack with shouts, with volume. But Americans were different. First came the calculations, then silence, and then the collapse." This change in perception altered not only tactical behavior, but psychological behavior. Troops began to avoid fixed positions even before any firing. Wehrmacht reports record instances where entire platoons requested removal of newly constructed fortifications, claiming that, if it were concrete, it would be targeted. German doctrine was overcome by the irony of its own belief. That which was done to resist began to attract destruction. On the Eastern Front, German rigidity was still echoed in the fighting against the Soviets, but in the West, the enemy operated with a different logic. The Hauptmann Erich Manke, captured in Alsace, described, "We didn't know how to fight a peace we had never seen. What appeared were the results. It looked like witchcraft, but it was just technical superiority." He referred to the 240mm howitzers not as artillery, but as engineering tools in a hostile field. Recognizing this accuracy created a deadly paradox. The more the Germans reinforced their positions, the more they became targets. To fortify a church was practically to signal it on the enemy map. To turn a hospital into a command post was to condemn it to ruins. The logic of the M1 was implacable. It did not attack everything. It attacked the essential. And that was enough. In interrogations conducted by the U.S. Army, the emotional pattern of German officers was almost identical. Shock, incomprehension, technical respect. In one of the most emblematic documents dated April 18, 1945, a captain of the 19th Grenadier Regiment states, "We compared our artillery to theirs. We found out we were trying to stop a locomotive with rocks." The analogy, brutal and precise, summarized the growing asymmetry between the doctrines. While the Germans divided efforts between different models, single calibers and ambitious projects, the Americans simplified, standardized, and improved. It was a war between those who sought the extraordinary and those who delivered the efficient. This veiled respect was transformed in certain cases into religious fear. In Trier, Soldiers of the 212th Volksgrenadier reported that after the destruction of 3 consecutive positions with isolated 200 mm fire, they began to refer to the howitzer as der Hammer Gottes, the Hammer of God. The nickname, although informal, appeared in at least 7 reports intercepted by Allied forces, and, for intelligence analysts, it was the confirmation of something bigger, the breaking of conviction. The enemy had ceased to believe in victory, and had begun to fear a repeat, because what the American howitzers delivered above all was deadly predictability. If a shot fell in one position, it was certain that another would come. Constancy was more terrifying than power. In the post-war period, German military historians tried to reinterpret this doctrinal defeat. Some attributed it to the loss of air superiority, others to a shortage of resources. But in the inner circles of the Wehrmacht, one confession recurred. We underestimated American industry. And worse, we underestimated their ability to turn logic into weaponry. What for the Germans was an architectural decision, for the Americans was a calculation variable. And this difference was costly. The testimony of Wilhelm Azer, a German military engineer captured at Pirmasens, sums up the tragedy. We built to withstand the impact. They calculated to cross. We never had a chance. This phrase, cold and without rhetoric, is the epitaph of a doctrine, because the war was not won only in battles. It was won on paper in stress tests and production spreadsheets. The hammer that fell on the German fortress was not made of bronze. It was logical. And if the accounts of the captured German officers already showed resigned admiration, what would follow would widen this contrast irreversibly, because the next revelation would not come from an enemy. It would come from within, of an officer of the Reich himself who, in the face of the results, would admit strategic failure in the face of an adversary that he himself had considered inferior. And this testimony, recorded in the secret archives of 1946, would be the end point of an illusion built in concrete. In February 1945, a secret order was issued by the German 7th Army. It strictly forbade the continued occupation of fixed fortifications under threat from large-caliber American artillery. It was a veiled but definitive admission. The bunkers that for decades had symbolized German invincibility had become traps. The war, for the Reich General Staff, had become a brutal paradox. What represented security now represented sentence. Static positions, celebrated since World War I as vantage points, became landmarks of absolute vulnerability in the face of the new kind of American-led war. A war of precision, mobility, and calculated industrial power. The irony was unbearable. The country of precision engineering had been defeated by simpler but immensely more effective engineering. What the Germans built with concrete and prestige, the Americans tore down with logic and steel. And perhaps the greatest fracture of the war was not on the ground, but in doctrine. Centuries of military tradition based on fixed lines, trenches, and fortifications collapsed in the face of the adversary's mechanical adaptability. The 240mm M1 wasn't just a gun, it was a philosophical denial. With each shot, he said that the world had changed, and that the future of war no longer belonged to those who entrenched themselves, but to those who moved, calculated, and dared to break patterns. Entire Wehrmacht manuals were revised. Defense doctrines were hastily rewritten, exchanging armor for mobility, permanence for elasticity. Troops were instructed not to occupy fixed buildings for more than 24 hours. Command posts began to move each night. And even then, reports kept recording devastating losses caused by long-range howitzers. The static fortress had died, but its shadow continued to attract destruction. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. Germany itself had witnessed, in the lightning campaigns of the beginning of the war, the superiority of mobility. But when it came to defending himself, he chose to repeat the past instead of reimagining the present. Meanwhile, the United States bet on the logic of industry in motion. It was not enough to mass produce. It was necessary to adapt in real time, convert technical intelligence into strategic advantage. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts buried in the engineering of war, show your support. Like and subscribe so that we can continue to bring to light stories like this, where each screw has the weight of a doctrine, and each shot carries the collapse of an ideology. The impact of the M1 did not end on the battlefields. It reverberated in the corridors of military academies. in doctrine notebooks, and in the strategic debates that would shape the second half of the 20th century. There was no glory in the fall. There was a calculation, and for many German generals this was the hardest blow to assimilate, that they did not lose out of moral inferiority or bravery, but because they insisted on a logic that the enemy had already overcome. Colonel Rudolf Steiger, in charge of the defense of a line of bunkers in the Trier region, summed it up in his final interrogation. "We expected a clash of wills. We face an equation, and we lost." The 240mm howitzer proved that modern warfare would no longer be decided by the heroism of a besieged post, but by the ability to think about the battle even before the first shot. A doctrine had been born. Another had been buried. But the most bitter lesson was yet to come, because among the rubble of the cities and the craters in the fields, an uncomfortable question remained. What if the enemy had understood earlier? What if the Germans had, from the beginning, adapted their defensive logic to the new paradigm of American war? The answer, revealed in an internal Wehrmacht study rescued after the war, would be baffling. A simple calculation, forgotten amid the noise of the bombs. A fact that, if understood in time, could have changed the fate of thousands of lives, and perhaps even the course of the war. Behind each accurate shot, there was a body in tension. The operators of the 240mm M1 howitzers were not just cogs in an industrial cog. They were men put under relentless pressure, both physical and moral. The sound of a 360-pound projectile detonating echoed like metallic thunder, reverberating through the bones, piercing the skull with a vibration that could not be muffled even with the best hearing protectors of the time. Many gunners left the front with permanent deafness. Others developed repeated concussions, chronic tremors, visual fatigue, and recurrent episodes of disorientation. The medical records of the 697th Artillery Battalion point to a 380% increase in cases of vertigo and chronic headaches among the men who worked directly in the handling of the super-heavy howitzers. The effort required to assemble, calibrate, and maintain these gigantic systems in hostile environments required more than physical strength. It required a nervous endurance that few could maintain for long periods. And there were the forward observers. Operating in the shadows of the enemy line, hidden in ruins or elevations, were the eyes of the howitzers. Men like Lieutenant Raymond Brooks, stationed for 11 consecutive days in a destroyed agricultural silo near Saarbrücken, with no medical support, no safe routes of withdrawal. They knew that any radio emission could draw counter-battery fire. They knew that the Germans considered them a top priority. And they knew, more than anyone, what their calls for fire would cause. Because they saw it. They were the first to see the impact. The columns of smoke, the pieces of concrete flying, the disjointed bodies. In his diary, Brooks wrote, "I knew it was necessary, but I'll never know if it was right." The precision, celebrated in Pentagon spreadsheets, had a cost that could not be calculated in tons. Each successful shot was followed by a charged silence. The operators, although far from the target, understood what they had done. Descriptions of clean zones, areas where nothing was left, became common in internal communications, but they did not lighten the weight of the gesture. Many scorers returned home with recurring nightmares. One of them, identified in Veterans Department files as Operator DF, reported, "It was like crushing a city with a hammer, but the hammer was my hand." The brutality of efficiency left invisible marks. Tremors in the hands, aversion to sudden noises, bouts of anxiety, episodes of apathy. The war had been won with logic, but its executioners were made of flesh. Even commanders trained to rationalize losses admitted discomfort. Colonel William Radford, in a letter to his wife, confided, "These howitzers work, and that's what scares me. They work too much." The coldness of the calculation collided with the conscience of those at the center of the operation. It wasn't just about destroying structures. It was about extinguishing entire positions in seconds. With no eye contact, no chance of surrender. Modern artillery had won, but human beings still processed war in moral, visceral terms. And this abyss left scars. In the mobile workshops where the howitzers were repaired, the mechanical sergeants reported an unusual phenomenon. Many operators spent quiet hours after missions, meticulously cleaning parts that didn't even need maintenance. A kind of ritual. As if, by restoring the machine, they could restore some meaning to what it had done. In interviews conducted in the 1960s, Dozens of veterans described a similar pattern, a refusal to talk about the successful shootings, not out of shame, but out of emotional exhaustion. The repetition of the impact, the expectation of destruction, the certainty of the collapse of the target, all this isolated them. They won, but returned to the tents empty. The machine worked perfectly. The doctrine was right. The results were undeniable. But the cost, although silent, was high. And perhaps that's why, decades later, so many of these men refused medals, avoided veterans' meetings, and kept what they experienced secret. Because they knew that in order to crush the enemy concrete, they had to harden from the inside. And that, at times, was harder to bear than the fire itself. By the end of the war, of the 2,156 operators directly involved with the M1 howitzers, more than 70% had symptoms of hearing and emotional disorders. In a confidential 1946 report, the Army classified these consequences as acceptable operational side effects. But for the men who lived through it, nothing was acceptable. Modern warfare had created soldiers who won without seeing the enemy, but who carried every impact on their own bodies. And while the world celebrated the victory, many of them just wished for silence. However, among these veterans there were also those who, despite their weight, understood the dimension of what they had done. One of them, Sergeant John Harris, wrote in his memoirs, "I did not shoot at men. I shot at the lie that concrete was stronger than truth. Because deep down, that's what the 240-meter M1 destroyed. Not just bunkers, but illusions. And the most dangerous of them was that one could resist the future with structures from the past. But not everyone accepted this doctrinal collapse. In the ruins of the Reich, some German engineers insisted that their fortifications had been betrayed, not vanquished. And one of them, in charge of the defenses at Aschaffenburg, drafted a memorandum that was never published, a desperate attempt to save the Reich's engineering honor. The contents of this document, rediscovered in Allied intelligence archives, offer the ultimate confession, and perhaps the most revealing of all. War, as an operational concept, has been quietly transformed behind the lines, and the agent of this transformation was not an infantry revolution or a flying machine. It was a smooth-bore metal tube, 12 meters long, that fired 360-pound projectiles more than 25 kilometers away. The 240mm M1 howitzer didn't just defeat fortifications, he reconfigured military thinking. Until then, artillery was, in essence, a volume force. The winner was the one who fired the most, created the most craters, covered the most territory with fire. But the logic of the M1 was different. Shoot less, never miss. This required something radical in times of total war, coordination. Artillery crews now relied on accurate weather data, maps corrected by aerial photogrammetry, constant communication between observers and calculation centers. The Fire Direction Center, or FDC, became the brains of the operation, calculating corrections in real time and relaying millimeter instructions to the guns. Artillery ceased to be a brute force and became a steel scalpel. This model of surgical strike, which today defines entire doctrines of modern armies, was born there. The philosophy that power lies not in the number of shots, but in the ability to eliminate the target with as few shots as possible, materialized in the field with the M1. At St. Lo, a single shot destroyed an observation tower with 5 levels of reinforced concrete, saving hours of bombing and hundreds of lives. On the Gothic line, the fortified positions on the mountainsides were pulverized with mathematical precision. The response time between target identification and impact was getting shorter and shorter. On some occasions, less than 5 minutes. And with margins of error of less than 50 meters, the probability of success in the first round reached levels that seemed fictional in the 30s. This technological leap created a chain of consequences. Observers began to be trained on advanced geometry. Meteorologists became part of the theater of operations. Mathematicians were required to perfect ballistic tables. And while Germany insisted on wonder weapons of artisanal production and limited catastrophic effect, the United States created a replicable, scalable, and accurate model, a logic of efficiency that would be the basis of modern artillery systems. The guided missile, the military GPS, the computerized artillery, all these elements carry in essence the doctrine inaugurated by this silent howitzer. It was he who proved in the fields of Europe that the future of war did not belong to the spectacle of fire, but to the mathematics of impact. In 1946, a military conference held at Fort Sill reviewed the operational data of the M1. The final report, titled Efficiency of Heavy Artillery and Fixed Target Neutralization, was distributed among U.S. military schools and NATO allies. Among his conclusions, one phrase stood out: precision is power. It was no longer about volume, it was about certainty. From then on, fire doctrines began to abandon prolonged barrages and seek punctual attacks, based on intelligence, coordination, and informational superiority. The 240mm M1 wasn't just a weapon, it was a prototype for the future. The impact was so profound that even the USSR, with its doctrine of saturation, began to experiment with adaptations inspired by American methods. In 1953, the Soviets created the ARS-4 fire control system, based on observation of the American FDC model. The M1 had left the field, but its spirit, the logic of precision over waste, had been assimilated even by its rivals. And with the advent of computers in the following decades, this doctrine would only intensify. Today, a laser-guided projectile can destroy a moving bunker 70 kilometers away. But this capacity is born from the same logic applied by the operators of the M1 on the hills of Anzio or on the slopes of Cassino. The howitzer itself was retired in the 1950s, but his DNA lives on. In every digital aiming system, in every ballistic calculation algorithm, in every surgical operation conducted by modern forces, there is the shadow of the 240mm, the shadow of a war in which winning meant thinking more, calculating better, and making fewer mistakes. A war in which the sound of victory was not the constant roar of thousands of gunfires, but the precise silence of a single, well-planned impact. The future was shaped there, among the ruins of what was once considered indestructible. And if the past has taught us anything, it's that underestimating the mind behind the machine is a fatal mistake. The Germans believed that concrete would protect them. M1 showed that no material resists intelligence applied with discipline and scale. The real fortress of modern warfare is not in the walls. It is in the integration of knowledge, machine, and doctrine. And among the rubble of pulverized bunkers, a new era was born. But history still holds its last irony. Among the field reports filed in the United States, there is an almost forgotten document, dated March 1945, where an American engineer, witnessing the devastation wrought by its creation, wrote, "We are seeing the beginning of something much greater. If we continue on this path, one day we will destroy not only the bunkers, but the cities themselves." This grim warning brings us to the last piece of this story, the moral legacy of precise power. Because more than changing the war, the 240mm raised a question that to this day remains unanswered: whether it is possible to win perfectly without losing humanity in the process. In essence, the 240mm M1 was cast steel, applied calculus, and propulsive energy stored in cartridges. But its real impact transcended the physics of the shot. It was a philosophical statement. Every shell that demolished a German bunker carried more than explosives. It carried the symbolic weight of a society based on freedom of production, the scale of civil effort, and flexibility of thought. The super-heavy artillery of the United States, manufactured by female workers in continuous shifts, supplied by coordinated railroad networks between states, and delivered to the front by citizen soldiers, directly confronted what the Reich believed to be indestructible: technical supremacy, sustained by ideological obedience and forced labor. The German bunkers, erected by prisoners on the orders of the Todt organization, became tombs of an outdated belief. It wasn't just concrete that fell. It was the concept that rigidity could trump adaptability, that imposition could trump inventiveness. The story of World War II is usually told through battles and treaties, but there are times when technology becomes a symbol. The M1 was one of those milestones. He showed that true strength came not only from the size of a bomb, but from a nation's ability to mobilize intelligence, labor, and resources in harmony. Germany, with its obsession with unique weapons and unyielding doctrines, struggled to maintain a house of cards. The M1 wasn't spectacular like the V2 or mystical like the Royal Tigers. It was a simple piece within a complex system, and precisely for this reason, unbeatable. Instead of tactical miracles, the United States bet on logistics, coordination, serial engineering, and they proved that, in the face of a systematic problem, the response should be systemic. The destruction of the fortifications was therefore not just a military feat, it was a historical lesson. When they collapsed, the bunkers revealed something more than shattered walls. They exposed the moral bankruptcy of a regime that had built its foundation on fear and rigidity. Aschaffenburg's pillboxes, reduced to rubble in minutes, cost years of forced labor. Rationed steel and cement diverted from civilian infrastructure. On the other hand, each American shot was the result of a voluntary production chain, of engineering schools connected to factories, of intellectual freedom translated into combat innovation. American superiority was not an accident. It was a direct reflection of a model of society in which collective creativity triumphs over authoritarian control. In a memo captured in Alsace, a German major writes, "We have trained to withstand the impact. They train not to make mistakes." This phrase, among so many, sums up what was at stake. While Germany educated its soldiers to withstand bombings, the U.S. developed technologies to prevent them, and by aiming accurately, eliminating efficiently, and advancing consistently, the U.S. military has demonstrated that modern power is not born of intimidation, but of integration. American artillery didn't just break through the Reich's defensive crust, it revealed the doctrinal emptiness beneath that shell. The belief that concrete could contain change evaporated at the first well-directed impact, and, with it, the arrogance of a technical empire that despised the industrial logic of its adversaries. This battle between models was not limited to the battlefield. It shaped the post-war period. Nations that rebuilt themselves on the basis of open production, technical exchange, and logistical efficiency inherited the vision that M1 represented. Those that tried to revive vertical structures and closed doctrines were once again faced with the fragility of inflexible systems in the face of coordinated dynamism. American super-heavy artillery was the visible tip of a conceptual iceberg, a model in which collective intelligence, decentralization of ideas, and strategic standardization could coexist without sacrificing effectiveness. And perhaps this is the greatest irony of all, that a weapon created to destroy bunkers has become the symbol of a world that has chosen to build with freedom. That the deafening noise of a 240-meter projectile has, in its explosion, echoed a clear message. Authoritarian structures do not resist the methodical advance of organized freedom, because in the end, the real fortress was not in the concrete. It was in the factories, in the calculations, in the workers and engineers who, without uniforms, won a war against rigidity with the only weapon the enemy ever understood, the ability to think in scale. But before the smoke from the impact completely cleared, one last mission would be entrusted to the M1, a task that, while it seemed military, carried much greater symbolic weight. One last fortification, designed to withstand everything, still stood in the path of the Allies. And what happened there was not just the collapse of a structure, it was the end, literal and symbolic, of the concrete as a doctrine. When the last 240-millimeter shells were fired at the final strongholds of German resistance, it wasn't just concrete that fell apart. What collapsed was a conviction, the belief that engineering alone could halt the advance of a nation whose strength lay not in steel, but in scale. The fortresses of the Reich, erected as monuments to doctrinal rigidity, collapsed in the face of a system that united freedom of thought, mass production, and mathematical precision. The collapse of the Siegfried Line, Alpine bunkers, and urban fortresses was not an artillery accident. It was the inevitable outcome of a war in which a flexible, industrial, and coordinated society faced an authoritarian structure, slow and burdened by its own myths. The 240mm M1's win was less about brute force and more about applied intelligence. In each shot there was calculation, engineering, logistics, and a human chain of competence. The doctrine of fixed defense, which for decades guided Europe's strategies, ended not by surrender, but by obsolescence. The sound that came out of the howitzer barrel was, in practice, the death certificate of military rigidity as an absolute principle of survival. The great lesson that emerges from this account is direct and uncomfortable. Systems win ideas. Logistics wins doctrine. And the volume, when combined with the organization, surpasses even the technical genius. Nazi Germany invested in fortifications as it would invest in dogmas. Unquestioned, imposing, but immovable. The United States responded with movement, calculation, adaptation, and rhythm. Where one saw war as a wall to be maintained, the other saw a flow to be conducted. And this conceptual difference is what defines modern warfare. There is no longer room for blind faith in unshakable structures. History shows that when technology goes hand in hand with flexibility and logistics planning, no wall is eternal. Fortresses did not fall because they were poorly built. They fell because the world around them had already changed. And perhaps no one understood this as well as General Heinz Ziegler, when he declared in his final report, "We were defeated by trucks, not by soldiers." In one sentence, he translated the shock of an entire generation. The surprise of seeing the doctrine itself evaporate in the face of the scale of an enemy that promised no miracles, only constant delivery. If you value this search for facts that reveal the real gears of history, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. This is what keeps alive our mission to tell what really shaped the century. Activate the bell so you don't miss the next report and comment below. What was the most shocking data in this video? The number of bunkers destroyed, the psychological impact on soldiers, or the simple fact that precision has defeated arrogance? Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.